to start the day, and that's on integrity in the VCM. It's moderated by none other than a board member and IETA dignitary, Katie Sullivan, with a very distinguished panel. And this is, of course, one of the main subjects, and I think a topic that's attracted a lot of attention and scrutiny over the past couple of years, but one where I think the sector's made a lot of great strides in trying to address the different criticisms that have been lobbed, but also moving forward in many, many innovative ways. So please join me in welcoming Katie and the panel to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm impressed as well. I know some of you didn't get in till quite late, but I was very responsible last night because I had a very, very important plenary to moderate today. So Katie Sullivan, International Emissions Trading Association, and we navigate all markets, compliance, pre-compliance, and voluntary. And over the last couple of years, the voluntary, very, very active. And there's a lot of progress that has been made, but still a lot of challenges and hiccups, what many of us are seeing in the market right now. So I would like to welcome on stage my fellow speakers here. So we have, well, actually Amy Merrill, who is the CEO of the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market, the ICVCM, is joining us, hopefully, virtually. And we have Chris Davis, and you can come on up, Executive Director, Climate and Nature Collaborative. We have Craig Ebert, Special Advisor to CAR, former President and CEO of Climate Action Reserve. And we have Eduardo Piquero, CEO of Mexico CO2. And gentlemen, I'll probably sit in the middle here, and we do have Amy that is plugged in. And maybe just a quick note, as a longtime friend and supporter of CAR, I am tremendously excited for Robin to now take the torch from Craig, who did an outstanding job over the years. And we all are thrilled to see Robin kind of move forward in this leadership position at CAR. So thank you, Robin. Oh, hi. Okay. So let's do a quick canvass of the room. How many of you have been in carbon markets for, say, the last 2 years, or COVID 2 years? All right. Keep your hands up if you've been in carbon markets for 5 years, 10 years, I went down, 20 years. A resilient bunch. We all started when we were very, very young. That's great. So, again, over the years, we have seen, certainly on the compliance side and like IETA, that's a North Star in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of activity across regions, including close to home, California and beyond. Voluntary has always been there, the voluntary carbon market, and always been very, very important, and also a space where there was a lot of, and continues to be, a lot of innovation and leadership that occurs on the voluntary side. But really over the last kind of several years through COVID, voluntary became very, very important. There was a lot of attention paid to the voluntary space, and it's been going through quite an evolutionary moment, as we all know, right? So we are going to have a very frank discussion with these esteemed panelists to actually take stock of where the voluntary carbon market is today, what is working, what is not, right? Where there has been some very, very real progress, maybe not at the speed as some would like, but progress nevertheless has been made, and what will be coming not only years from now, but expectations through the coming months and vellum in November of this year. So that is just kind of, and I promise you, we are going to leave time to open it to the audience for questions, okay, at the end. So we'll do a quick round of just initial interventions, then have a bit of moderated dynamic discussion up here, and then open it to you to ask these guys any questions you want. So Amy Merrill, we are gutted that you can't be here with us in lovely Los Angeles. And we do appreciate you staying up through dinner, past dinner on your side of the pond. Everybody is talking about ICVCM as usual in the NACW community here over the last couple of days. So really from the CEO, and you've been before being appointed to CEO, you've been involved in the ICVCM during a really, really critical phase, right, of the startup. So I'm gonna just pass the torch to you to give us the latest on ICVCM and the progress you've made. And I think it would be helpful to level set about some of the results, some of the outcomes, say, of the CCP announcements that have happened recently. Amy?
Thanks. Yeah, sure. And I am, as I'm really sad to not be with you in person. And it sounds like everyone had a great night last night. I was working, so I can only wish I was with you. And thanks very much for the chance to talk about where we're at. I mean, I don't know if you want to do a show of hands as to who knows what the ICVCM is, and there's this extra points if you can actually spell out the acronym into what it actually is. But the Integrity Council is here to try to bring comparability and standardization to a degree to the market, and to set a threshold for high integrity so that investors can come back into the market, so it's a market that everyone can believe in, so that it can thrive and deliver its part of the private climate finance that is needed both domestically and abroad to deliver on the essential goals of a decarbonization journey, including under the Paris Agreement. And what we've been doing since the assessment of the rule framework and the 10 core carbon principles, which I'm sure everybody has memorized, is assess carbon crediting programs like CAR, like others, and methodologies. And, in 2023, that assessment process started, and it's still underway. And we've made very good progress, and doubtless progress less fast than people will want, and I will come to that. And so we have, 98% of the market by volume was under the assessment umbrella. 38% of the volume under methodologies that has been issued, 38% has been assessed, 3% passed, 35% has not. 26% is still in assessment, and 36% wasn't ever put into the assessment process by the programs that run those methodologies. And that's at the methodological level, right? And so much of the assessment that has been done to date, as you may know, was done through multi-stakeholder working groups with many people probably in this room and at the conference today having been involved in one or more of those groups. And we're really grateful to the collective effort of the market to engage in that stakeholder-led discussion around methodologies. And so many of those methodologies that were assessed last year in those groups are in write-up phase, and particularly things like IFM, Ag and Art, those things will be coming through the pipeline very soon, we hope. So, where are we at now? We rejected, the ICVCM's governing board rejected methodologies relating to renewable energy on the basis of the lack of evidence of additionality. And it kind of points to this need to be more robust in the way we communicate in methodologies, in program governance, and transparency about the way in which the market is working, because that's what rebuilds the trust, and that's what's helping everybody come past this difficult stage of inconsistency and lack of comparability towards a market that has transparent systems, robustly quantified methodologies, clearly additional projects, and the like. And so, where we're at right now is the signs show that this process seems to be working. There are emerging price premiums for CCP labeled credits. So that's labeling by programs of projects issuing credits under approved methodologies. And there's a price premium emerging. There's also a retirement preference emerging for CCP labeled credits. And what's really important to understand, I think, is that that's because all the major programs applied, and a load of new programs, emerging programs, have applied. And when I say programs in ICVCM, we mean what other people call standards, registries, etc. And I think that shows the collective will to engage in creating a coherent market that has clearly communicable levels of quality and holistic engagement across all of the issues that make for a good carbon project, including sustainable development benefits and social safeguards. And so that's the work we're doing on assessment. And alongside that, we're becoming more and more engaged in the thought leadership work, which I know many people in this room will have also been involved in. And we call them continuous improvement work programs. And what we're finding there is that the collective intelligence of the market can help bring everybody on to the next level of integrity in things like permanence. So we did work last year in permanence, in a permanence working group. Some really interesting findings from that group. They will be published soon, and more work will follow. And the same for social safeguards and sustainable development. The threshold in the assessment framework of the ICVCM was pitched really high, but it's still an area where the market needs to move further and have more consistent understanding of what best practice looks like. And again, that collective endeavor of all the stakeholders, all different perspectives, academics, business, developers, sort of civil society and oversight systems, everyone together around the table brings a really good collective understanding of the challenges of theory versus pragmatism, cost versus benefit, and those kind of things. And so we're working now on issues like market transparency, scalability, along with IETA and the World Bank and others. And we're also about to start a work program on, for example, transition crediting. Later in the year, we'll look at VVBs, DMRV, jurisdictional crediting. So, you know, there's lots of thought leadership where the collective intelligence of all the participants in the market right now is being brought together to look collectively at what good looks like. And so I think that, hopefully that tries to set the scene at where we're at. And we can come back to talk about some of the other things we're doing, and I'll hand back to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Amy. It is really quite a heroic effort, and a lot of resources, time, energy has gone into it. Still, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, a baby, right? Like 2 years, 2.5, like not a long time. One thing, again, for this, actually, I'll do it for you. How many of you, before meeting Amy, knew about ICVCM and have been tracking the ICVCM process? There are lots of hands in this room, Amy, so you know. But I think it would be helpful, because even myself, we lose track of what announcements have been made for CCP eligible. And again, hundreds of methodologies you're reviewing, right? But there have been announcements going back through, say, last spring or fall. So what are the methodologies, the announcements, the project types that you have out there right now? Quickly, I know you can do it off the top of your head.
Like a test, isn't it? So recently we made an announcement around the cook stoves decisions, where new cook stoves under new cook stove methodologies with certain conditions around what's called the FNRB can get the CCP label credit. We also earlier in the year, actually I think it was last year, this year's already moving too fast, we rejected a lot of renewable energy methodologies on the basis that the evidence of additionality was not robustly enough set out in those methodologies, and recognizing that that's a really important area globally for continued crediting in carbon markets. We'll do some work on that. In relation to RED, there have been decisions around new methodologies, and we continue to assess some aspects of some methodologies in that sector. And earlier last year, we took some decisions on landfill gas, approving those. So you can go to our website and see every decision and every explanation provided by the governing board around why those decisions were taken. And we have still we have a lot of decisions expected in the next few months around improved forest management, agriculture, ARR, and removals later in the year.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amy. That's really helpful. So ICVCM, supply side, right? Demand side. And that is, I mean, the supply side, it's not perfect, not totally sorted, but there's a lot of work, on the supply side happening. There is a lot of work on the demand side happening, but also if you ask anybody, in this market, what's the issue? What's the problem? Where we need demand, more demand. Where's the demand? Why aren't we getting the demand? So Chris Davis, you are, first of all, why don't you explain to the group just the hat or hats plural that you're wearing right now with the Climate Finance Collaborative, right, and the High Tide Foundation, and how you are seeing the demand side of the equation kind of moving forward or not in some ways, and some of the initiatives that you are really quite involved with on the demand side with other corporates, and not just corporates, but other stakeholders.
Thanks, Katie. To follow up on your question, I'm a senior fellow at High Tide Foundation, and working with a wide cross-section of both companies and NGOs. We're engaged in a sort of philanthropy-supported effort to explore initiatives and find ways to, generally support increased corporate investment into both nature and climate. Many of us who are working from this particular perch are former sustainability people within various companies, many of them fairly ambitious climate companies, some of them in this room. And so much of our perspective that we bring to this work very, very much comes from a kind of applied, what I would sort of call a practitioner's perspective of trying to work to help the internal decision-making that has to happen in companies to get them to allocate, let's not forget, voluntary capital towards these enormous challenges that we have. So it's fun to follow up on Amy's great comments and be part of a panel that she's sitting on, because I think there's so much positive work being done on the supply side. And we have, as Katie said, we have a sort of probably pretty clear idea in this room of the problem that we've been trying to solve on the supply side. And you heard a very clear rendition of the work that ICVCM is doing under Amy's leadership to address that. I think the challenges on the demand side are a little bit harder to put our fingers on. What I would say is that in the name of accountability and a sort of theory of the world that companies need to be held ultimately responsible for the very particular nature of their emissions and the part of the problem that they're driving, we've built a system that highly prioritizes that corporate accountability. Which means, ever more particular concerns about exactly what's in a value chain and what a company is responsible for, while at the same time, apparently because of deep concerns about some aspect of the demand world, increasing the number of constraints that we put on companies to do something about that value chain or about that carbon footprint. So what we're seeing, I think, right now in a lot of the frameworks and the sort of systems that are intended to kind of give corporations and companies clarity about how to invest, what to invest in, how to account for what you're investing in, is a set of constraints that are making it more and more difficult, and I fear leading us to a place where only the wealthiest, largest companies are going to be able to make progress towards net zero as we've defined it. What do those mean? I mean, things like increasingly, because of this focus on value chain, we want to see all of the things that companies do and invest in show up in a company's inventory as defined by the scopes 1, 2, and 3. We do that despite the fact that we know from IPCC and other sources that there's so much work that needs to be done that is never going to find its way into a corporate inventory in most cases. Investments in nature, investments in things like methane capture, investments in things like expansions of renewable energy. These are large system scale things that we need to see transformed, that corporations can have a role in helping to do. But because corporations are so strongly incentivized to only invest in the things that are going to show up in their own inventory, we're seeing capital sit on the sidelines rather than invest in those things. So how do we do this? We spend a lot of time trying to really think about what is a value chain and what is a footprint, and how can we decide whether a particular activity is linked to it. We focus on things like traceability, which is increasingly difficult to define. We saddle companies with very ever-growing sort of pictures of what scope 3 responsibilities they have. So for most companies, probably in this room and otherwise, if you look at your inventory, the biggest proportion of it is scope 3. And it's probably your fastest growing piece of your GHG kind of liability. And yet the majority of things that you can do about scope 3, because it's indirect, it's based on data and modeling for most companies, can't count. You have very limited control over that. So what we're seeing, I think, again, is this sort of sense of increasing constraints. what have the frameworks done to try to sidestep some of this? We've created things like language to suggest how, where, in addition to working in your own value chain, you can invest outside of your value chain, beyond value chain investments, contribution type mechanisms. I just want to give you a little bit of a flavor of what it looks like to be a sustainability staff in a big company when that's what you're being told to do. You've spent an enormous amount of your capital and your team's capital building a company's commitment to making a public-facing net zero commitment and to taking the steps to start to move progress towards that. It's extremely challenging to win that support internally.
To be clear, before, you've worn many hats. I've always worn the IETA hat since we've known each other. So Governor Inslee, Amazon was Chris before, worked at Amazon, and then Carbon Cure before this role. Just so when you say what you know.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks. So just making that pitch is really challenging. And then you say, here's a handful of things that really need to be done. But if we invest in these things, it doesn't count towards our target. And the look that you get back from an executive is really perplexing. So again, this sort of sense of what counts and what doesn't count is a real problem for us. So if we want to expand demand and we want to grow the amount of investment from companies, we need a new framework to incentivize companies to do that. We need assurable third-party standards that give credibility to investments outside of a value chain. We need flexibility in how to count the things that companies could invest in. We need reporting frameworks that allow companies to bring those investments forward and communicate them to their stakeholders and their customers in transparent and credible ways. And so I think that those are the kinds of themes that we're trying to push into some of the ongoing consultations right now.
So do those exist today?
I'm sorry.
Do those exist today?
I think we've seen a little bit of progress in some of the releases. I mean, we're seeing flexibility in the scope 3 definitions from the recent SBTI drafting. We're seeing a little bit of possible daylight on the use of instruments, market-based tools for some scope 3 type of emissions. But these things are still, I mean, A, they're still in development, and B, they're very much still linked to the idea that the stuff has to show up in your value chain. So we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to demonstrate that a particular investment that a company wants to make is somehow tied to the players and organizations that it works with directly.
Thanks, Chris. And I was going to go, but I think actually we'll go Craig first. And again, well, Craig, you can be unleashed now. I mean, to an extent. We don't want to, worry Robin or others.
Robin just fainted.
No, be honest, as you have always been honest, and you and the CAR team, and like all ICP, independent crediting programs, who have not just been going through the ICVCM process, but going through the Corsia process, going through ICROA, isn't it? Like there's many, and you are all very lean teams. I honestly think that many people who are in this orbit and they're like, oh yeah, CAR and Vera and ACR, and think that there are hundreds of people at these organizations, right, that are like plowing through this enormous amount of work on requirements and engaging with these meta standards, right? It's not. You are lean, right? And you're going a million miles a minute. So I think I just want to recognize that, because I have the mic and I can do that. But I would love to hear, where you are thinking ICVCM, have been going through, but also what is still VCMI on the demand side, but then just broadly, what's working well and you're really bullish on, and where are some things you're like, we got to pivot.
Well, we do need to pivot, and I wanted to carry on with what Chris was saying. He's made a number of excellent points that all of us in this room are probably experiencing. And let me just start out with what's the obvious, but we seem to forget this, which is the fact that, we're past the point of debate that humanity's frying this planet. We've missed 1.5, we're gonna miss 2, and who knows where we're headed, but it's serious. What that means is we need mitigation now. Not in 5 years, not in 10 years, and the challenge is unleashing the capital to do that. As Chris pointed out, there's a number of frankly, barriers we're creating that's preventing that. But I think, it's got to start with every business, every organization has to basically make that commitment. That step number 1 is we will commit to mitigating now. If they don't, they should shut down or admit that they don't care about the climate, because that's how serious it is. Secondly, I'll say it flat out. We need to stop this Scope 3 nonsense. I've done a lot of GHG accounting in my life, and I'm not saying that corporates shouldn't be accountable for things in their value chain, but as Chris was pointing out, we're asking every company to develop this core expertise internally on doing value chain accounting, and it's an endless chain of events heading down numerous rabbit holes to figure it out. For what purpose? All for the point of trying to figure out what their target should be. Well, Carbon Disclosure Project has pulled together a summary of information across different sectors globally that indicates how significant Scope 3 is for most companies. Use that factor, and it's often over 90% or close to it for a lot of sectors, and just say, hey, do your Scope 1 and 2 and then multiply it by that factor. That's your target. That's just going to save a lot of time. It's going to provide a lot more clarity to the corporates. The other thing we have to quit doing is trying to figure out externally how to put so many constraints on mitigation actions. And I know there are a lot of reasons why people say, well, they should be focused on Scope 3, or they should limit this type of credit or that type of credit or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, the boundaries of our entire program here is the planet Earth. We shouldn't care where the mitigation happens. And let the companies find out where it's most cost effective. That's their expertise. I've worked with enough companies to know their focus is first going to be on internally. They always want to clean up their own act before they start paying it out. But so what if they want to, quote, buy their way out of the problem? That's how we're going to put capital into the developing world to make sure that they can achieve a net zero path. So, back to your specific question, there are a lot of these efforts out there that are confounding everybody on a daily basis. One that we've fully embraced and I think needs to succeed is the work that Amy's leading with the ICVCM. There are enough questions around quality in the VCM that it's good to have the ICVCM working. And I've been saying, from the get-go, after some initial skepticism, because nobody likes somebody looking over their shoulder, but in this market, someone has got to set the standards for quality. That's what the ICVCM is trying to do. They've got an enormous amount of work to do. You can only imagine trying to do this global program, and we all wish, could they go faster, what have you, but I appreciate just the amount of effort going on behind the scenes to define quality. So we have no problem being held to that quality standards because we know that every credit we're issuing is of high quality. We may not always agree with the ICVCM, but that's fine. That's part of the ongoing discussion. But some of these other efforts, frankly, like SBTI and VCMI, are just encouraging delay and creating the confusion that Chris was talking about in the C-suite. We don't have time for it, and nor do we need it. We can give people concrete targets. Will we collectively make mistakes along the way? Of course we will. But right now we're letting perfection be the enemy of the good. And if we just have to adopt a different attitude, that if we see a company that you think made a bad investment for whatever, still congratulate them for what they're doing, but provide constructive input to it. And that's what we need to do collectively. This name calling and accusing people of greenwashing, certainly when it comes to the voluntary market, you got to remember, voluntary. They don't have to do a damn thing if they don't want to. And that's why a lot of them aren't right now. The risks are too high, the rewards are too low, and we have to change that equation. I'm happy to talk about some of the other efforts, but let me stop there for now.
I guess the one thing it might bleed into later discussions it does feel like this market just kept getting punched in the gut over and over and over and over again. Punched in the gut, some valid, a lot not so valid, right? And the fear then of businesses to do anything. Do you feel as though we have crossed the Rubicon a little bit from or we've lost so many along the way that?
We're definitely making progress. I think we're at a takeoff point, not just for the VCM, but hopefully for just mitigation writ large. I do think to the extent that we don't hold the demand side accountable is important, particularly in the area of credits. You want to hold the Climate Action Reserve or any other suppliers accountable for the quality of what they're bringing to market? Absolutely. No excuse for low quality bottom feeders in this market. It's too critical. But don't blame companies if they're trying to do the good thing, are not carbon market experts or climate policy experts for that matter, and may invest in the wrong thing. And I'm not saying we may not try to want to put some guardrails on, limiting the percentage of nature-based credits, for example, or solutions, whatever. But the path we're heading down now, we're making it enormously complex because it's presumably feeding somebody else's policy objectives that it's hard to believe it at times that has anything to do with saving our climate.
Yeah, well said. So, that is, okay, allowing for companies to pragmatically actually reach the goals they set, that's number one, right? And I do think there's a bit of a emperor has no clothes moment that people are saying, hey, wait a sec, and yeah, these markets actually, they matter, and credits, they matter a lot. It's also driving finance into communities, including the Global South, right? And so, Eduardo, hi, friend.
Hello.
You've always had Mexico CO2 hat. As long as I've had IETA. Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
I was born in Mexico City.
But you know a lot more than Mexico, and you obviously live and breathe these markets. And you are on the circuit also across Latin America, and you might do as many carbon 4 as IETA does globally, that's really saying a lot. So why don't you give us a bit of a spotlight, first of all, let's level set, spotlight on the VCM, the activities that we're seeing right now in Mexico, and if you want to go a bit beyond, right? What kind of the projects we're seeing, the kind of the brighter spots, the project types, right, that are getting a lot of uptake, maybe how ICVCM or the other are helping, or maybe not so much.
Sure.
So give us that, and then I want to pivot to the government angle as well.
Wonderful. Well, it's going to be long, but I'll do my best. Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's an honor, of course, to be here with Craig, of course, our former president, and I echo Katie congratulating our new president, Robin, and trust he's going to do a terrific job. I'm particularly interested in the intersection between the voluntary and what's going on in Latin America, the construction of new non-voluntary spaces. As you know, Latin America has been a large supplier of forestry projects, mostly red, but IMF is a very successful story, and the role of the reserve has been crucial for Mexico specifically, and I trust it will also be crucial for the rest of Latin America. As of today, a very successful story is going on in Chile, where there is a tax and offset scheme with not enough projects supplying the local market. Projects need to comply with certain characteristics. They need to be not that old. Only vintages that are only 3 years old could comply with that scheme. And we are seeing this year a total amount of around 6 million tons being transacted in that market specifically. What kind of projects? All kind of projects. Additionality must not be treated globally. We know that what is additional, perhaps in Latin America or elsewhere, could not be additional in a different space. I do believe, Katie, that we haven't praised the reserves approach enough. The role of having standardized baselines and country-level approaches, it's a wonderful and powerful tool for the reserve. It has proven to be a really successful story for Mexico, where over 400 projects are currently being developed, and they're channeling resources to really poor communities. And it's proven to be a really successful approach to tackle deforestation and other ways of living in Mexico. So I do think that definitely that has a future for the rest of Latin America. Not only in Chile, but also in Colombia. There is also a tax and offset scheme in Colombia, quite successful, though quite also struggling. We do see some other developments. The Dominican Republic about to publish ETS secondary regulation, and probably another program taking off there. Hopefully that's the case. Again, not enough projects in the Dominican Republic. We need to look there specifically for renewable energy projects. They have a an enormous problem and an enormous potential for renewables that it hasn't been unleashed yet. So we need that also to happen there. We know that Panama and Ecuador both are thinking what to do and different programs all on the region, and some others. We do see the Argentina province of Córdoba also trying to explore a program to be launched this year, if everything goes okay. It's gonna be the first one in that country. And of course, we have Brazil. That's a very big story, transitioning from a 100% voluntary carbon market to, let's say, an ETS. Hopefully that happens, and that happens soon. Probably in 2029, 2030, we're gonna hear, and we're gonna have that ETS up and running. What kind of projects would be active? Of course, lots of forestry projects. Corresponding adjustments, it's something that will happen also in Latin America. We still haven't worked that out in most of the regions. And of course, there is Mexico. Well, Mexico's story is quite a long one. Mexico did have an ETS pilot for a couple of years, an incomplete pilot, I would say. But now with a new administration that took office 5-6 months ago, they've just figuring out what to do. Our bets are that it will be mostly, I mean, the proposal for a new ETS would be mostly offset-centered. So I would expect an active role of offsets in Mexico's achieving its own carbon emission reduction targets. And at the same time, I would also expect a very active voluntary carbon market in Mexico itself. How that's going to communicate or not with the local taxes that have developed in Mexico over the last 6 or so years, that's still a question. We have in Mexico currently 4 different carbon tax and offset schemes. We have Querétaro, Tamaulipas, Colima, and Guanajuato. Altogether is a total demand of 6 million tons every year. And we don't have enough projects for those schemes to work by themselves.
Because I'm always so impressed by Querétaro. What's the price right now?
It's 30 US.
32 US dollars.
Yeah, and the following one would be Colima with a 25 US. That's quite important. And then we have Tamaulipas, 15 US, and Guanajuato with 5 US per ton. So it's kind of a puzzle in Mexico. So it's a question how the federal system would work with the states. We're learning about a lot about how Canada's scheme, how that works.
Elbows up. Yeah, you have to be Canadian to know.
Of course, Australia and some other federal jurisdictions that are quite interesting. That gives me 2 really important takeaways. Number one is the reserves approach hasn't been praised enough. The reserves approach to work on a standardized baselines and country-specific levels, it must be replicated elsewhere in Latin America. We cannot analyze additionality at a global level. We need to do it locally. The level of penetration of renewables in Latin America is still quite low, so that's an open discussion, and I would expect renewable projects to also be quite active in Latin America in the forthcoming years. And number 2 is that there is a really very important reality check. Markets are linked even though there is no regulation. For instance, to pay those taxes in Mexico, we're using international offsets because we don't have enough offsets in Mexico.
What one?
Colombia. Mostly Colombian projects are active in Mexico.
Are being used for compliance
purposes.
I didn't know that.
So, yeah, so...
so that's why it's red, okay. Yeah.
That's why, exactly, that's why. So the fact is we need emission reductions and we need them fast. And sometimes regulation comes really not on time, let's say. And I hope Mexico moves forward with it ETS this year. However, let's see what happens at the subnational level.
2 questions. So has Mexico put forward its NDC 3.0 yet?
No. No, but it's under development.
2, okay, 3 questions. Second one. When ICVCM, and I don't mean to have an awkward moment, but like the renewables decision, right, that Amy and the ICVCM team, they spent a lot of time and they made a decision and very transparent. Did that have any ramifications on some of the renewable energy kind of projects or investments or things that were being watched in Latin America?
Not that I know of.
Okay, that's really good to know. And it segues to a question, Amy, I'm gonna ask you, but very importantly, and I think for the whole backdrop of this discussion, is nearly all of the markets that you just reamed off in the last couple of minutes across Latin America, when you say that they are moving forward with a trading system and a compliance offset system, are they doing that from scratch, or are they leveraging the VCM, what's been born on the VCM side?
120% on the VCM. We're learning everything from VCM. We're starting not from scratch. We're starting with projects that were active under VCM and CDM.
And that is a top takeaway. And Latin America's not alone.
That's right.
Go across to Africa, Asia was kept very busy, right? They are leveraging what has been born in the voluntary side of things, hopefully the best bits, and it's assurance, the methodologies, the registries, the tracking. Okay, Amy, I think that set us up quite nicely. First of all, with the, just broadly, not about the renewables, but like just broadly as your team and really the board, the experts, all your working groups, when something is rejected, what is the dialogue there? How are the programs reacting to that? And not the markets necessarily, but is this a sign that is almost welcome that they're going to then reapply eventually?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because what's the purpose of rejection? The purpose of rejection is just to indicate that a methodology needs to be revised, and it needs to do things need to change for it to meet the CCPs. And so with the renewables, the issue there was about the evidence of additionality. And so what will happen is those methodologies, people will take them away. Many of them are CDM based. And so those anyway are being retired at the end of the year. And so, and look for better ways to communicate that need to evidence additionality, and understand how you understand if something has financial additionality, when this sort of economics of renewables is so complex anyway. But, I think that the thing to understand is that what we've really seen as well is that everybody, carbon crediting programs, like CAR, obviously everybody understands their business, right? And so one of the things that we also see is that ICVCM has put in a threshold that collectively helps the market reorient, right? And it's not just through rejections of methodologies that the market has done that. So we see project developers making choices around, does this methodology look like it has a chance of passing the CCPs? Which programs have been CCP eligible? And so many programs are coming into the ICVCM now saying, yeah, we want to go through this rigorous process because it helps us attract project development. So I think one of the things that, rejection sounds like a bad thing, but actually it's one way to help the market collectively have rationales to move on. And it helps programs move methodologies onwards. It helps projects decide to move to newer versions. I mean, I have spent far too long in the carbon markets, and in the old days, you would never change the version of the methodology you used unless your crediting period ran out. Now, there's much more willingness to move to a newer version of a methodology while your crediting period is still in play. And I think that shows that everybody collectively is understanding that the evolution of rules as they happen needs to be incorporated into the way the market operates.
Thanks, Amy. And that is, it's quite helpful. I don't know if many people recognize, unless you're, again, in the belly of the beast, like some of us, recognize how much work is being done by ICVCM around the world with governments. So as much as there's the big V, right, in the voluntary side, but you are doing an awful lot of work, you and the team and the community, with governments. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, and I think it sort of builds on the points we've discussed about the way that domestic programs have leveraged the VCM and continue to do so. One of the really interesting things that we've discovered since the publication of the assessment framework is how many interested governments there are who want to engage with ICVCM as a way of helping them manage their policy mix. So we have, for example, supply-side countries who want their domestic programs to be assessed by ICVCM, which is really interesting as a concept. And we have supply-side countries who turn to their developers and say, well, we will approve projects that have CCP-approved methodologies, right? And so they're using that third-party layer to help them access the part of the market that they can add to their policy mix, because they feel that it's been through a stakeholder-led process that builds trust for them. And then I think the other thing that we're seeing is that on the demand side, and we saw this with the 2024 US statement, creating safe harbors for people using CCP labeled credits. And we're also seeing some regulators use the CCP criteria as a gateway into their domestic systems. So there's kind of 4 different ways in which we're seeing that happen. And it shows that, I think, something that makes a lot of sense now, which is that ICVCM, we're trying to build globally interconnected, locally relevant markets. We're trying to help get the CCPs used as a way of enabling domestic systems to access international finance, and enabling domestic project developers to find international buyers. And that helps with price transparency. It helps with mitigation action, as Craig was saying, getting projects to actually happen where it's cost effective to do them. So I think, one of the really interesting things about everyone's collective journey in this market is creating this interconnectedness between different domestic frameworks.
Thanks very much, Amy. Yeah, that's great, and I definitely want to come back to you, but we are running out of time, and I did promise we're going to open it to the audience. So just a quick other round. Chris, I think things are happening. A lot is happening. A lot is happening. There are so many consultations. There are so many draft guidance and, working groups and focal groups and technical groups, and the list goes on. And, there's only 24 hours in a day and everybody's exhausted, right? So how are you thinking about, and I say you, but I mean the broader kind of community you're helping to convene on a regular, triaging. What is near term quite important, and that is coming down the pike? And I'm thinking 219 has kept us quite busy, and it's actually quite appropriate because we're in California right now, but on the climate disclosure stuff and in the world of credits and reporting accounting you talked. So do you want to expand a bit on 219? Sure. And then maybe if there are others, triage, in the spirit of triaging that folks should be looking at?
Sure. So 219, for those of you who are not watching the day-to-day grind of California legislative politics, is a sort of pre-rulemaking process where the agencies are planning to do regulations to implement 2 major reporting and disclosure bills that were passed about a year ago by the California State Legislature and signed by the governor. What 219 does is basically bring together the rules by which companies will file regular disclosures of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, much like some of the regulations we see in Europe, characterize and quantify the risk of their business operations to future climate change impacts, including potentially their influence on that risk. And so there's a whole body of reporting and disclosure requirements. What is the connection to this? Why is this relevant to what we're talking about today? We see in regulations like this an opportunity to do a couple things. One is, as I mentioned earlier, to increase transparency and visibility on what companies are doing. Those provisions in that rulemaking and the legislation are heavy on the tell us a lot about the damage you're creating in the world and tell us it in great detail and use this format, and light or non-existent on the side of tell us what you're doing about it and how what you're doing mitigates or abates or over time is reducing the risks that you're creating over here. So what we've done is to try to feed into that rulemaking process, again, speaking from where I said we were coming from, very practitioner-oriented, real-world type perspective on how can companies simultaneously share, report, quantify, validate the investments they're making. Many of those investments in market-based instruments. So certainly some of these could be offsets and credits, but there are also environmental attribute certificates, RECs, in the future, green steel, green shipping fuel type investments. And how should those be quantified? How should they be reported? How can they be credibly communicated to the community, to stakeholders, and to regulators that these are things that companies are undertaking to address the sort of sin side of the ledger over here? Why? Because I think there's a subtle, or maybe not so subtle, affirmation that comes from the government in a regulatory structure like this, eliciting that information. So what you're essentially doing is, in some ways, validating that body of work. Again, provided that all the things you're listing on these disclosure requirements come with CCP labels from reflecting the good work that Amy's team is doing, or other kinds of quality type criteria. So it doesn't take away from or erode from the necessity to ensure that those are real, that they are quantifiable, that they are unique, that they are not double counted. But by making the opportunity visible for companies to report that, there's an affirmation that those are realistic and credible tools. Other things happening, again, I think just to this general idea of constraints that come around. We have in California 285, which is another piece of regulation. We have, as a community, I'm sure many of you active in the market have sensed and realized, we have adopted slowly this theory of change that credits associated with reductions of emissions are somehow less credible, less needed, less substantial than credits that come from removals. And so we're seeing a lot of focus on, as companies migrate, because there's clarity in the standards about removals and there's a lack of clarity around reductions, we're seeing companies move towards their investments towards removals. And as we're doing this, we're seeing regulation come forward and say, okay, what do we need to know about removals so that we're confident that those are have integrity and are real. And again, we're seeing a lot more rules on, equating, in the case of 285, equating the type of emission that you have on sort of your sin side with the type of removal. So a sort of like-to-like relationship between the nature of the removal and the nature of the underlying emission you're trying to abate. What that does is sort of push people away from nature, because most of unless you're an agriculture or a forestry company, most of your emissions are going to be combustion related, and nature-based removals would not be eligible to mitigate those combustion related emissions. And so again, we're taking the impulse that companies have to go invest in these things, and we're circumscribing what's eligible and what's allowable in ways that at first glance maybe look like they're creating some sort of integrity, but what are actually doing is forcing companies to spend more and more time on precision and on data and trying to get to granular levels of information to justify what they're doing at the expense of investing more. And so there's a trade-off at work there that isn't always visible, and what we're doing in the policy setting is trying to make those trade-offs visible to the policymakers who are driving these things.
This is very important, what Chris just said. I leave after this plenary to go hopefully catch my plane. Hopefully you don't, and I encourage you to take a bit of Chris's time, or others who have been quite involved in these discussions on like for like, just on the margins after, to kind of learn more and engage, and why should you care about this, because it's not just in California, this is cropping up. I don't know if you have any, Craig, any responses to that, or you want to kind of share. We didn't get, I want to make sure that the role of the subnational leadership and the voluntary corporates, you also have gone global with us for many, many years on the COP circuit, right? And so I do want a few thoughts on that, and through BELM, not necessarily that you'll be there, but how, or even a call to stakeholders to make sure that the voluntary market is showcased and the US leadership is showcased in BELM. But I'll just give it to you.
Well, thank you. It's obviously critically important, given the current administration, that subnational action get highlighted and frankly accelerated. Unfortunately, we're in a similar circumstance that we were back at the beginning of the first Trump administration, when he backed out of Paris. And the We Are Still In movement stepped up, of which many of us were a part. And it's made a significant difference. Frankly, that effort needs to be amped up this time around. The Climate Action Reserve, along with the Climate Registry, every year hopes the subnational delegation to COP. And that's just an important message. And when you get on the ground, we need to create the same sense of interest and frankly success in BELM that happened in Bonn, when After Trump withdrew from Paris, and we are still in, went to Bonn as a big pavilion celebrating the ongoing subnational commitment to climate action, it electrified the entire COP because they were thinking, well, the US might not even show, it's going to have a muted presence, whatever. And the message was quite the contrary. We're not going anywhere, hence we are still in. That objective obviously is critically important right now, and I know we're starting to gear up for that for COP30 later this year. But as I said, it needs to be amped up.
And I mean, for the reserve and for a lot of others with the voluntary space and nature being the theme, right? And making sure that the experiences in the US that were actually unlocked through markets and the VCM on nature are properly broadcast. Did you want to say something else? Yeah. Okay. How many questions are out there? Okay, let me just get a show of hands for the questions. How many people? All right, this isn't your only shot. You do have lovely Miriam. So, and where are the mic runners? The folks helping with, okay, perfect. So it's right behind you. So before we go, Amy, in the audience and just in the US, you have a lot of tribes and indigenous leaders, right, that are deeply involved with the voluntary carbon market. And ICVCM has a platform to bring these leaders globally together. So could you say a few quick words on that? Because I would be remiss if we got off stage and you didn't share that with the audience.
Yeah, thanks. So the ICVCM hosts a self-led forum called the Indigenous Peoples Local Communities Forum. And it's got 8 representatives who all applied and were successful in their applications and have created this forum to create a place for centralized voice and peer-to-peer learning. And the ICVCM did this because at COP 27, a group of Indigenous leaders came to the ICVCM and said, you're talking about high integrity. There's no high integrity carbon market without understanding and giving a place to Indigenous views and Indigenous knowledge. And so the ICVCM shaped that out with those representatives and with its Indigenous board members. And that was launched last July, and it's had several meetings. And if people are really interested in engaging with it, it has 7 priority areas, and we'd be really happy to share that information. And it's it's run by those representatives, and we're there to host and make sure that we're supporting it in its work.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. So that is a call to any of those who want to learn more. I assume on your website, or we can just pass along some of your colleagues' info to individuals who are interested. Thank you. Lovely, Miriam. Okay, we have a question right there.
Thank you for the great panel discussion and the great moderation, Katie. My name is Marion Verle. I'm the CEO and co-founder of SustainCert. We're a climate impact verifier. I haven't been in the market for 20 years, but almost. And I would agree with you, Katie, that it's been refreshing to see all the work that has happened over the last few years to raise the bar on integrity. And in large part, this is due to the work that the ICVCM has been doing, Amy. So well done for that. We're big fans of the creation of this standard or meta standard. I have a few questions for you, Amy, to understand a little bit better where you're headed with the ICVCM. I think the first question is around the governance of the ICVCM. As your role is being amplified and becomes really central to how the VCM operates, we can also expect that the level of scrutiny over the ICVCM governance is going to increase. My understanding right now is that the governing board is the final decision maker on many critical issues. And this is also the governing board where funders of the ICVCM are represented. So I'd love to understand if, in your view, this could represent a risk to the perceived or actual impartiality of decisions that are being made. And if that's the case, then what are your plans to maybe evolve your financing model to make sure that the ICVCM brand remains as credible as we all want it to be? My second question is on DMRV. As you know, Sustain Cert, with many other players, we've been leading the pack on digital verification over the last few years. And what we've learned through our work is that for digital technologies to be widely adopted in carbon markets, we need a new level playing field. The current rules of the game are not fit for digital technologies to be adopted. And so there's been a lot of work done on that front, including recently with the World Bank CMI working group. So I'd love to hear a bit more about your plans with the ICVCM on the MRV and how you're planning to leverage work that has been done on that front to date. And my final question, I promise it's the last one.
You're allowed.
It's specifically on VVBs. It's great actually to see that VVBs were on panels during NACW this year. So thank you so much for creating space for us to engage in the conversations. I think there's about 60 or more active VVBs in the carbon markets right now. We play a central role in ensuring the integrity of carbon credits, and yet we feel underrepresented. With the ICVCM, we have an industry association led by Javier Castro, who's sitting next to me, the International Association of VVBs. How can you help us, Amy, make sure we're better represented in the work of the ICVCM, especially now that you're opening a working group on the VVBs? Thank you.
Thanks, and they're great questions. We have Javier, I think, if it's the same Javier as on our expert panel, but you know,
He's nodding. Yes, it is.
So you know, that's one way we have VVBs represented in the ICVCM, and I think it's an area we understand. You know, there is a whole other space for discussion. I mean, I think we'll all agree that in the VCM, you know, in the days of CDM, VVBs or DOEs as they're called in that system were all under the authority and supervision and watched carefully by the CDM accreditation structures. And in the voluntary carbon markets, there hasn't been that sort of single oversight structure for VVBs that would enable everybody to understand who's doing what and how well it's all being done. And so, you know, one of the interesting pieces of you know, discussion for the voluntary carbon markets is how do we enable VVBs to really operate and thrive and learn best practice and from each other and showcase themselves. And we will have a work program on VVBs and Marion, I've added your name to the list and it will be starting soon. And so, you know, if you're a VVB in this audience, that work program will probably start later in the year, and it will be a really holistic look at, you know, that centrality of function of VVBs. And, you know, I think everybody really does understand just, you know, there are no carbon project issuances if VVBs are not engaged. So I think that's right. And I think when the ICVCM was set up, its focus was delivering a framework for programs to be able to implement. But, you know, the next step comes with ecosystem evolution. And so we'll be hoping you'll join us on that. And I think, you know, that's the same. The same goes for that story about a DMRV. I think, you know, it's one of the things that the ICVCM board, who do take the final decisions, who are supported by the independent experts and the multi-stakeholder working groups and the staff at the organization, you know, there's an understanding that, you know, DMRV can really help unlock a scale and lower transaction costs, but it's really difficult to deploy lots of stuff right now. And the way the market works, you know, it needs evolution for that. So again, that's a collective stakeholder working group, and we'll all be looking at that. And you know, when coming back to your question, Marion, governance does matter. We have 19 board members. We have incredibly detailed conflict of interest policy, huge definitional processes, declarations for everything, including turning up at meetings. Every kind of discussion has to be declared against conflicts. But board members have to meet criteria of being independent. And so you can have a look at that on our website. And so, you know, how do we manage it? We have, you know, I'm a lawyer by training. The chair of the governing board is former Securities and Exchange Commissioner. There is no space to hide in the ICVCM because we're lawyers and so we have really strong governance. And, you know, one of the things that the voluntary carbon market needs to be able to scale is for everyone to adopt robust, transparent and effective governance and be prepared to engage with regulators on the governance. And so, you know, we get those questions from regulators. How do you take decisions? Well, there's independent experts. They work sometimes as a panel for the rule development framework, individually contributing to MSWGs and as a panel in evolving rules. And they participate in CIWPs. We have the governing board, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you have a look at our website, you'll just see that we're very transparent about the way governance works, and we hope everybody understands that the ICVCM demands transparent governance of its programs. We put ourselves to that, and that helps everybody build that trust. And so, have a read of the conflicts of interest policy and the incredibly long definition of a perceived conflict of interest, and I'm happy to engage on it. So, thanks.
No surprise, we got such smart questions from Miriam, and actually some really great responses there. I think it would be VVBs, we might as well call it a day without VVBs. And they don't get as much, I think they're sexy, but they don't get as much attention as they deserve. And there is, frankly, quite a shortage of supply out there as well. And so I'm about to ask Eduardo about what you are seeing about the availability of the VVB stuff, but also how you're seeing DMRV actually start to crop up across the region.
Definitely. We definitely need more BVVs in Latin America. There is general scarcity of validation verification bodies all across the board. So please come to the reserve. We beg you to be there. There is a growing demand for your services, so do please. And another call for standards would be, please start considering digital MRV. Yeah. It's on the deadline. We need digital MRVs to move faster, specifically for removals and satellites. I mean, it's high time we start adopting tools that help us enable large scale, because that's something that the demand requires urgently.
Gentleman over there. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Lee from Wovoka. We're a project developer in the Philippines. I promised to ask an easy question this time, but I think we're spinning up a lot about quality, right? And quality is certainly important. But if you think about a lot of the concerns we have, especially for reforestation or forest protection red credits, a lot of the issues came from the lack of remote sensing, right? Or the lack of actually having good agreements and property rights in place, right? I know for a fact that anything in the Philippines, I can de-risk that part for near free. I could do that for someone. But we've spun up this whole quality and rating and everything else because of that issue that came out. So why can't the registries just have that as a milestone, start creating credits that are kind of pre-issuance credits, allow corporates to act on that, bring money into actually solving the problem now? Because we have the ICVCM, we have the VCMI, we can agree on the same acronyms, but what about the ICY SP, right? In case you care about solving the problem, let's just bring money to doing the work, avoid some of the clear problems that have come up, and drive money to the finance that matters, right? I mean, I gave B0 a bad time yesterday, but 200 million venture dollars have been spent on 2 quality rating companies, and they've rated less than 500 projects. So that's 200K per project, and sure, it's gonna drive this large market in the future, but project developers need money now, corporates need to be pushed to act now. How are we gonna do that?
I'm going to give that one to Craig.
Well, the quick answer from a Climate Action Reserve standpoint is we have a program that will allow for what you're calling pre-crediting. But it's not an easy jump from awarding an ex-ante credit to recognizing an ex-post value. And at the end of the day, that's what we need. We need actions that have actually reduced mitigated emissions. Now, we have our Climate Forward program, and there are some key reasons why it was created, but it doesn't work across the board. What it does allow, in the case of reforestation, which it takes you often decades to get to the point where you've got significant quantities of carbon sequestered, it allows an investor to recognize the potential value and essentially create a futures. We call it a forecasted mitigation unit. And we have a mechanism in the case of reforestation where a couple of decades down the road or whenever the project developer feels, they can then convert those to climate reserve tons for use in the voluntary market. But it doesn't work. We primarily developed that program for applications under something like the California Environmental Quality Act, where some company has a future, a new project that's going to generate a future stream of emissions. The point being, if you're going to generate that future stream of emissions, take actions now to mitigate that future stream of emissions, and we'll allow them to make investments in those ex-ante credits. But certain activity types, like we have reducing emissions from mega fires that encourages one to get out into the forest and frankly clean up the fire load. Open-ended question, how do you convert that on an ex post basis? We certainly don't have the pathway to do that. So there's select circumstances, and reforestation is a good one. We've had companies tell us they like that because once they've got that quantifiable FMU, forecasted mitigation unit, created, that's something they can put on their balance sheets, and it's essentially like a futures contract. And from a financial perspective, that makes all the difference in the world. I think underlying your question is the more fundamental need is we need more capital to invest in projects. And I think that's what one of the themes we're talking about today is how do we unleash the enormous capital available from the private sector to solve this problem. I said earlier in the conference, any of you waiting around for governments around the world to step up and make a significant enough difference will die of old age before that happens, unfortunately. So it really is, the private sector that has the key to solve this problem. And the options are staring us in the face. We know how to green electricity grids. It's cheaper to build renewable plants now than it is to operate existing fossil plants in most places. We're clearly seeing a transportation revolution of electric vehicles coming to market. That's not stopping. You combine those two things and it's about 65% of the global footprint that you're addressing. We need to accelerate that. The remaining emission levels, there are things we're already trying to do, whether it's methane recovery from livestock operations or landfills or reducing N2O emissions from adipic acid or nitric acid plants. That's what I find so infuriating. The solution set, after several decades of working in this space, is staring us in the face. What we lack is the will and the mechanism to make that investment. And that's how we need to unleash the capital. That'll create, I think, what you're calling for sort of pre-investment opportunities. That capital does need to flow.
Did you move because you want to say something? I actually think, Amy, I'm not quite sure how many folks in the crowd know how, bless you, years probably shaved off your life working at UNFCCC and on Article 6 and getting it through the finish line. Thank you for all that you do. Well, not getting it through like the whole Baku, but you took it a long way. So probably better than many people right now in LA, the Article 6 space, right? And also possible risks around, corresponding adjustments, revocation, and, engaging again with countries. So bringing it back to the VCM and the ICVCM and the world of Article 6. Again, we're gonna park the fact that US has exited Paris, okay? Or maybe it becomes more interesting. But quick thoughts, because I think it's worthwhile for the audience to be aware of this.
Yeah, so quick thoughts about where that's going or the relationship between them, just to be clear and quick.
Both in 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds. Article 6 is the part of the Paris Agreement that relates to carbon markets. It has a mechanism that issues, which is like the programs here, like CAR. It operates has methodologies and issues credits, the quality of which remains to be seen, given that a lot of that first chunk will be from CDM, which is an older form of crediting under the UN. And, countries can help meet their NDCs. And what's going back to Chris's point earlier, the way that countries can meet their NDCs using carbon markets through universal agreement is less restricted than the ways we let corporates behave under a lot of frameworks, which is interesting. And so what does Article 6 do in relation to the voluntary carbon markets? Voluntary carbon markets deliver compliance-grade credits into countries' NDC compliance. And that's what we're seeing right now. And that's really interesting because it means that if you have a CCP labeled credit, and for example, Singapore says, yeah, that can come into in my NDC use, then you have created one interconnected market. And that's why understanding regulation in carbon markets really matters. And I think it goes back to the points about what's going on in Latin America at the moment.
Thanks, Amy, for letting me put you on the spot like that. But also, you are, ICVCM, very engaged and watching across the whole Article 6 orbit. And it also goes to how we see the narrative, definitely in a lot of our spaces, where the V, right, the voluntary, now, hey, it's verified, right? It's a verified carbon market, and these credits could be used for multiple purposes, depending, right? It could be, here's a CORSIA here, Article 6 there, voluntary potentially compliance, right? We are out of time, but I think that just very, one or two quick words of inspo from each of the speakers about just the VCM and going forward, or just a call, not to arms, but just a call for those in the audience to kind of take away and act potentially. Chris, first.
I think in our most climate ambitious companies and otherwise, we have some of the best long-term thinkers that we would want in the economy. And so I think their focus remains on making progress despite kind of what we're seeing in politics. Let's find ways to support and incentivize them to do more and to do it faster.
Craig?
I'm optimistic. I think we're at a takeoff point where the VCM is going to take off. Hopefully we're going to create the conditions to deploy that capital because, as I said, now is the time to make a difference. And I think over the next few years, we're going to see that take off and acceleration of action on climate.
That means a lot coming from you. Eduardo.
I'm also very optimistic, and I see the VCM as a cornerstone of some transitional schemes in the region.
Thank you. And Amy.
Yeah, I mean, carbon markets deliver finance and mitigation, and corporate action inaction should be indefensible.
Well, special thanks, Amy, for joining us late at night on that side. I'm coming to you in Lisbon next week, but also super appreciative of just your time being with us virtually, and obviously, lovely gentlemen, Chris, Eduardo, Craig, and not only a big round of applause for the wonderful speakers, also the CAR team who works their tails off for many, many months to bring our community together, despite the maybe gloomy, grim times internationally, and even in these markets, coming together in that connectivity with folks, and it's the CAR team that allows it to happen. So special thanks to that whole team. Robin, you have a good group. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.